The crash in the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of a storm, howling winds, rain hammering against the earth, and branches groaning under the weight of the deluge. Deep within this chaos, Jack Harrow sat in his modest cabin on the edge of civilization. The world outside had lost its luster years ago, and Jack preferred it that way. Retired from his career as an aerospace engineer, he now found solace in solitude, the only company being the occasional wild animal that ventured close to his home. As he sipped his tea, a thunderous crash broke through the storm's rhythm. The sound was unnatural, metallic, heavy, and near. Jack froze, his instincts telling him that this was no falling tree or prowling bear. He reached for his flashlight and raincoat, his practical mind already working to determine what it could be. Whatever had fallen, it was close enough to demand investigation. The forest was a maze of shadows and rain, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the downpour as he navigated familiar trails. The sound of the crash echoed in his mind, growing louder with each step until he stumbled upon the source. In a small clearing, surrounded by uprooted trees and scorched earth, lay a small, sleek craft, nothing like anything Jack had ever seen. Its surface shimmered faintly, even in the dim light of the storm, with designs etched into it that seemed to shift and pulse. His gaze shifted, and he spotted her. She was small, fragile-looking, and completely out of place in the chaos of the storm. Her pale blue skin glistened under the rain, her white hair plastered to her face. She clutched something against her chest, a pendant, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Jack's heart pounded as he approached. She was alive, but barely. "Hey," he called out, his voice trembling with concern. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. Her eyes, a mesmerizing silver, fluttered open briefly before closing again, her strength failing. Without hesitation, Jack scooped her into his arms. She was impossibly light, her skin cool to the touch, and she murmured softly in a language Jack couldn't understand. The storm pressed down on him as he carried her back to his cabin, his mind racing. Who, or what, was she? The craft, the symbols, her alien appearance, it all pointed to something far beyond his comprehension. But as he looked at the fragile child in his arms, he felt a surge of protectiveness. She needed help, and whatever her story, he couldn't abandon her. Inside the cabin, Jack placed her gently on the couch by the fire. He dried her off as best as he could and wrapped her in a thick blanket. The pendant in her hand glimmered faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was intricate, almost alive, and Jack couldn't help but feel it held some significance. Who was she, and why was she clutching it so tightly? The hours ticked by as the storm raged outside. Jack stayed by her side, his own questions mounting with each passing moment. As he watched, the girl stirred slightly, mumbling in her strange tongue. Jack leaned closer, trying to decipher her words, but they remained an enigma. Her breathing steadied, and she finally seemed to relax in the warmth of the cabin. Jack sighed, his mind torn between disbelief and determination. The logical part of him screamed to call someone, anyone, but a deeper instinct told him to wait. Whoever she was, she didn't end up in this forest by accident, and whatever had brought her here might not have been friendly. As dawn broke and the storm eased, the girl began to stir. Jack sat by the fire, sipping his coffee, his eyes locked on her. Slowly, her silver eyes opened, scanning the room before settling on him. She tensed, her body shrinking into the couch as though she expected danger. "It's okay," Jack said softly, raising his hands. "You're safe here." She didn't respond, but her trembling subsided. For a long moment, they stared at each other, an unspoken connection forming in the quiet cabin. Jack didn't know who she was or what had brought her here, but one thing was certain, his quiet life was about to change forever. A stranger in the cabin. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Jack's cabin, casting a warm glow on the wooden walls. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered in the form of scattered branches and waterlogged earth outside. Inside, the small cabin felt charged with an unusual energy, one Jack couldn't quite put into words. The girl sat curled on the couch, her delicate frame wrapped tightly in a blanket. Her silver eyes darted around the room, cautious but curious, like a cornered animal trying to assess a predator. Jack, sitting across from her with a mug of coffee in hand, studied her quietly. She clutched the strange pendant as though her life depended on it, her slender fingers tracing its intricate patterns. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the small object held the answers to the mystery she carried. Yet, he knew better than to push too hard. Whoever she was scared, and trust would take time. "Do you have a name?" Jack asked gently, keeping his tone calm. Her eyes flicked to him but didn't linger. Instead, she tightened her grip on the pendant and turned her gaze to the floor. Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. "Well, I'm Jack," he said, trying a different approach. "This is my home. It's not much, but it's safe. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." She didn't respond, but her body seemed to relax, if only slightly. Jack took it as a small victory. He wasn't good with kids, especially alien ones, but he knew enough to give her space. As the day wore on, Jack went about his routine, occasionally glancing at the girl. She stayed quiet, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. At one point, she ventured off the couch and began exploring the cabin, her movements cautious and deliberate. Jack let her wander, pretending not to notice, but he kept an eye on her. She stopped at his workbench in the corner, her attention drawn to the mess of tools and half-finished projects. Among them was an old broken radio, a relic Jack had been meaning to fix but never found the time for. She reached for it, then hesitated, glancing at Jack for permission. "Go ahead," he said with a small smile. "It's just junk, but if you're interested, be my guest." To Jack's astonishment, the girl picked up the radio and began fiddling with it. Her movements were precise, her fingers deftly rearranging wires and components. Within minutes, a crackle of static emerged from the speaker, followed by faint voices, local radio chatter coming through loud and clear. Jack blinked in disbelief. "You fixed it?" The girl nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips for the first time. It was fleeting but genuine, and it lit up her otherwise solemn face. Jack couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" he said, shaking his head. "Guess you're not just any lost kid." Her smile faded, and she lowered her gaze, the pendant catching the light as she clutched it once more. Jack decided not to push. Instead, he stood and grabbed a plate of food from the kitchen. "You hungry?" he asked, setting the plate on the table. "It's just eggs and toast, but it's better than nothing." The girl hesitated, then approached the table cautiously. She picked up a piece of toast and nibbled on it, her movements slow and deliberate. Jack watched her with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Whoever she was clearly trying to adapt. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the girl finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, and her words were broken but understandable. "Thank you," she said, her silver eyes meeting his. Jack smiled. "You're welcome." It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time since finding her, Jack felt like they were making progress. She didn't say anything more, but the fact that she'd spoken at all was enough to give Jack hope. Before turning in for the night, Jack decided she needed a name. Something to call her until she felt comfortable sharing her real one. He thought for a moment, then said, "How about Aria?" "It sounds fitting." The girl didn't object, simply tilting her head as though considering the name. Jack took that as acceptance. "All right then, Aria," he said with a smile. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." As the cabin settled into silence, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He couldn't shake the feeling that Aria's presence in his life was no coincidence. The craft in the woods, her strange pendant, and her unspoken fears, they were all pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever had brought her here wasn't finished, and Jack's quiet life was about to be anything but. The pendant's secret. The morning air carried a crisp chill, and the forest around Jack's cabin seemed unnervingly still. Jack stood at the kitchen counter, pouring 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself and a hot chocolate for Aria. She sat at the small table, her slender fingers wrapped around the glowing pendant she never let out of her grasp. Jack had begun to notice how often she clung to it, as though it were a lifeline. "Hot chocolate," Jack said, setting the mug in front of her. "It's not exactly alien cuisine, but most kids like it." She hesitated, her silver eyes scanning his face before tentatively reaching for the cup. She took a sip, her expression softening as the warmth spread through her. It was a small victory for Jack. As he sat across from her, his gaze fell once more on the pendant. The intricate etchings seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the light in a way that made it appear alive. Jack had been patient, giving her time to adjust, but the pendant, it was more than just a keepsake. He was certain of it now. "That pendant," he began carefully, "it's important, isn't it?" Aria's fingers tightened around it, her posture stiffening. She looked down, as though weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, she nodded. "Why?" Jack pressed gently. "Is it from where you're from? Your home?" For a long moment, Aria didn't respond. Then, with a shaky breath, she held the pendant out, her small hands trembling. Jack leaned closer, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. As her fingers brushed a hidden seam, the pendant sprang to life, projecting a faint blue hologram into the air above it. Jack's eyes widened. Symbols and diagrams spun in 3 dimensions, flickering and shifting like a living blueprint. At the center was a crest, an intricate design that seemed to radiate authority and power. "What is this?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "Home," Aria said softly, her first full word in English. Jack's chest tightened. He didn't understand the symbols, but the projection's complexity made it clear, this was no ordinary artifact. This was a map, a message, or perhaps a piece of technology far beyond anything on Earth. The hologram flickered, casting shadows across the cabin walls. Jack studied the symbols, his mind racing. He was no stranger to advanced systems, having worked on cutting-edge aerospace projects, but this was leagues beyond anything he'd ever seen. "This pendant," he said slowly, "it's proof, isn't it? Proof of who you are." Aria nodded, her expression solemn. "Important," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Family, gone. They took everything." Her broken words hung in the air like a weight. Jack felt his throat tighten. She wasn't just a lost child, she was the survivor of something catastrophic, and that pendant, whatever it was, held the key to it all. "Who took everything?" Jack asked, leaning closer. "Who's after you?" "Bad people," Aria said, her silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "They hurt. Want this." Jack clenched his fists. Whoever these people were, they were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had the pendant, and her. A protective instinct surged within him. He didn't know much about Aria, but he knew one thing, he wasn't about to let anyone hurt her. Later that day, Jack set to work securing the cabin. He reinforced the doors and windows, gathering tools and supplies for a potential escape. Aria watched him silently, her gaze following his every move. She was no longer just a scared child, there was a quiet determination in her eyes now, as though she was preparing herself for whatever came next. As evening fell, Jack sat with Aria by the fire. She had begun to open up, her sentences still fragmented but growing clearer. He learned that her family had been leaders, people who wanted peace. But a faction of their kind had rebelled, driven by greed and power. Her parents had tried to resist, and for that, they had been destroyed. Why didn't they destroy you? Jack asked softly. Arya hesitated, then touched the pendant. This, she said. Too important. They need me to control it. Jack frowned. Control what? She looked away, her face shadowed in the firelight. Everything. Jack felt the weight of her words settle over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Arya wasn't running from ordinary pursuers. She was the key to something much larger, something dangerous. And now, Jack was part of it. That night, as the fire crackled softly, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The pendant, the hologram, the crest, it all pointed to a level of importance that would attract more than just the people who had already hurt Arya. He had seen enough in his career to know that power like this was never left uncontested. He glanced at Arya, who had fallen asleep on the couch, the pendant glowing faintly in her hands. Despite everything, she looked peaceful, like any other child in need of care and protection. Jack's resolve hardened. Whoever came for her, they would have to get through him first. As the wind whispered through the trees outside, Jack sat with his rifle in hand, keeping watch. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure, the fight was only just beginning. Shadows in the forest. The cabin was shrouded in the quiet of the forest night, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of wind through the trees. Jack sat near the window, his eyes scanning the dark expanse outside. The glow of Arya's pendant cast faint blue light across the room, a beacon of mystery and danger. She lay curled up on the couch, her breathing steady but her face marked by tension even in sleep. Jack's grip tightened around the rifle resting across his lap. He'd fortified the cabin as best as he could, but the feeling that something was coming had grown stronger. The pendant's hologram and Arya's fragmented story had only confirmed it, there were people out there hunting her, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Then he saw it. A faint red glimmer in the distance, weaving through the trees like a silent predator. Jack's heart sank. It was a drone, moving low and slow, its unmarked frame glinting faintly in the moonlight. He killed the lights inside the cabin, moving silently to Arya's side. Arya, he whispered, gently shaking her awake. Her silver eyes fluttered open, their glow catching the faint light. She sat up quickly, clutching the pendant as her gaze darted to the window. "They've found us," Jack said in a low voice, his calm demeanor masking the urgency in his chest. "We need to go. Now." The cabin's door creaked softly as Jack eased it open, the cold night air rushing in. He motioned for Arya to stay close, her small frame now hidden beneath an oversized hoodie and scarf to disguise her unique features. Together, they slipped into the forest, moving as quietly as shadows. The drone hovered closer, its hum faint but distinct. Jack led Arya through a narrow path, his mind racing. He had hiked these woods for years and knew every trail, every hiding spot. But against advanced technology, his knowledge could only buy them so much time. As they wove deeper into the forest, the faint hum of another drone joined the first. Jack cursed under his breath. These weren't random searches, they were being tracked. He glanced at Arya, who was struggling to keep pace, her small hands clutching the pendant tightly. "Are they following this?" Jack asked, gesturing to the pendant. Arya hesitated, then nodded. "It signals. Can you turn it off?" She shook her head, panic flickering in her silver eyes. "No. Locked." Jack bit back frustration. He didn't blame her, this wasn't her fault, but they needed a plan, fast. They reached a rocky outcrop, and Jack pulled Arya into a narrow crevice, the walls damp and cold. He motioned for her to stay quiet as he peered out. The drones hovered nearby, their red lights scanning the ground methodically. Jack's mind raced. If they stayed hidden, the drones might pass. But if their pursuers were using ground teams, it was only a matter of time before they were cornered. Arya tugged at his sleeve, her expression urgent. She held up the pendant and whispered, "I can change signal. Maybe confuse them." Jack stared at her. "You can do that?" She nodded, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the pendant's hidden mechanisms. The holographic interface flickered to life, and Jack watched as her fingers moved swiftly, navigating symbols he couldn't comprehend. The pendant emitted a brief pulse of blue light, then dimmed again. Outside, the drones stilled, their lights flickering erratically before they veered off in opposite directions. Jack exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good work," he whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But we're not safe yet." The two pressed on, navigating deeper into the wilderness. Hours passed, the moonlight their only guide. Arya stayed close, her silent determination inspiring Jack to push through his own exhaustion. They finally reached a narrow ravine with an old ranger station perched precariously at its edge. The building was weathered and abandoned, but it was shelter. Jack pried open the rusted door, ushering Arya inside. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew, but it was secure enough for now. He barricaded the entrance with an old desk and turned to Arya, who had collapsed onto a dusty bench, her pendant glowing faintly in her hands. "Is it always like this for you?" Jack asked, sitting across from her. "Running?" She nodded, her expression weary. "Always." "No. Safe place." Jack leaned back, his mind churning. This wasn't sustainable. They couldn't keep running blindly, hoping to outpace people with resources and technology far beyond anything he could muster. He needed to figure out who was after her and why. More importantly, he needed to find someone who could help. "Arya," he said, his tone firm but gentle, "we can't keep going like this. If we're going to stop them, we need to know more. This pendant, what does it do? Why is it so important?" Arya hesitated, then held the pendant out to him. "It proves me who I am. They need it to rule." Jack frowned, piecing together her broken sentences. "So, without it, they can't take control?" She nodded. "Family's crest. Power. They, scared of it." Jack's jaw tightened. This pendant wasn't just a keepsake, it was a symbol of authority, something that could challenge the people hunting her. And now, by protecting her, he'd made himself a target as well. As the first light of dawn crept through the ranger station's cracked windows, Jack made a decision. Running wasn't enough anymore. They needed allies, people who could decipher the pendant's secrets and expose the truth behind Arya's pursuers. He didn't know who they could trust, but he knew one thing: the fight was just beginning, and he wasn't about to back down. He glanced at Arya, who had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her pendant still glowing faintly in her hands. Despite everything, she looked peaceful, almost normal. Jack clenched his fists. Whoever was after her would soon learn what humanity was capable of when pushed to its limits. Jack stared out at the forest, his resolve hardening. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. But this time, it would be on his terms. The betrayal in the town. The ranger station had served as a temporary refuge, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. The eerie quiet of the forest felt like the calm before a storm, and his instincts screamed that time was running out. They needed supplies, food, water, and a means to communicate with someone who could help decipher the secrets of Arya's pendant. "Arya," Jack said, kneeling beside her as she fiddled with the pendant. Her silver eyes met his, wary but steady. "We have to head into town. It's risky, but we can't survive out here without more supplies." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the glowing pendant tightly. "Bad people might see." "They might," Jack admitted, "but we'll keep a low profile. You'll stay close to me, and no one will know you're different." Arya nodded reluctantly, her trust in him evident despite her fear. Jack handed her a hoodie and a pair of sunglasses. The oversized clothes swallowed her small frame, but they did their job. Her glowing eyes and unusual features were hidden. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the lion's den. The small town bustled with morning activity as Jack parked his old truck on the outskirts. The general store, the diner, and a gas station formed the heart of the town, a hub of mundane human life. Jack glanced at Arya, who sat nervously in the passenger seat, her hands clenching the pendant beneath her hoodie. "Stick close to me," Jack said firmly. "Don't talk to anyone. We'll be in and out." Arya nodded, her silence speaking volumes. Together, they stepped into the general store, its bell jingling softly as they entered. Jack immediately set to work gathering supplies, his mind focused on the essentials. He kept one eye on Arya, who stood quietly by his side, her gaze flitting around the store with a mix of curiosity and tension. But then, the door jingled again. Jack's gut twisted as a tall man with sharp features entered the store. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. Dressed in a simple leather jacket and jeans, he looked like any other traveler passing through, but there was something in his piercing green eyes that set Jack on edge. The man's gaze swept the room and landed on Arya. He froze, his eyes narrowing as though he recognized something about her. Jack stepped closer to Arya, his body instinctively shielding her from view. "You've got a cute kid there," the man said, his voice smooth but tinged with menace. "Not from around here, is she?" "She's shy," Jack replied, keeping his tone casual despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. "Just visiting family." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Arya for a moment longer, his head tilting slightly as if he were analyzing her. Then, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Watch the company you keep," the man said softly, his words laced with a warning. Before Jack could respond, the stranger turned and left, the bell above the door jingling in his wake. Jack's heart pounded as he hurried to finish checking out. The shopkeeper, oblivious to the tension, made small talk, but Jack barely heard him. He glanced outside, scanning the street for any sign of the man. When he saw none, he grabbed Arya's hand and led her quickly back to the truck. "Are you okay?" he asked as they drove away, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Arya nodded, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing. Whoever that man was, he knew something, about Arya, about the pendant, about everything. They were no longer invisible. Back at the ranger station, Jack began unpacking the supplies, his movements sharp and hurried. Arya sat by the window, her silver eyes fixed on the forest beyond. The pendant in her hands pulsed faintly, its glow dim but steady. "Arya," Jack said, setting down a can of soup and turning to face her, "we need to talk. That man in the store, he knew something. We can't afford to stay here anymore." She looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "I know. What aren't you telling me?" Jack pressed. "Why would someone recognize you in a town like this?" She hesitated, her hands trembling around the pendant. "Signal," she whispered finally. "Pendant, it calls." Jack's chest tightened. "You mean it's broadcasting?" She nodded. "Can't stop it. They always find me." Before Jack could respond, a faint hum filled the air. His blood ran cold as he recognized the sound, drones. The red lights of two machines flickered in the distance, weaving through the trees like silent hunters. "Pack your things," Jack said urgently, grabbing his rifle. "We're leaving." But as they moved to the door, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Jack froze, his mind racing. They were already here. The door burst open, and the man from the store stepped inside, a small group of armed individuals behind him. Jack raised his rifle instinctively, but the man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, friend," the man said, his tone calm but commanding. I'm not here to hurt you, just her. Not happening, Jack growled, stepping in front of Arya. The man smirked. You have no idea what you've stumbled into, do you? That girl isn't just some lost orphan. She's the key to a war her kind started. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. She's a kid. She's a liability, the man snapped. Hand her over, and you walk away. Not a chance. The man sighed, his patience thinning. Suit yourself. In the split second that followed, chaos erupted. Jack fired, the gun's deafening crack echoing through the station. The group scattered, returning fire as Jack pulled Arya toward the back exit. Run! Jack yelled, shoving her ahead of him. They bolted into the forest, the sounds of pursuit close behind. The pendant's glow pulsed like a heartbeat, its light cutting through the darkness. Jack's mind raced as he led Arya through the dense undergrowth, his only thought to keep her safe. The betrayal had been swift, but Jack knew one thing for certain: if they were going to survive, they couldn't trust anyone but each other. The echo of the past. The forest swallowed Jack and Arya in its endless expanse of shadows and towering trees. Their footsteps crunched against the damp undergrowth as they ran, Jack's mind racing faster than his feet. Behind them, the faint hum of drones and the shouts of pursuers echoed through the woods, growing closer with every heartbeat. Jack's instincts kicked into overdrive. He had spent years trekking these woods, mapping every hidden trail and forgotten cave. He led Arya deeper into the labyrinth of trees, toward a place he had discovered long ago, a hidden ravine that might just buy them the time they desperately needed. This way. Jack whispered, pulling Arya's hand. Her small fingers clung tightly to his, her breathing sharp but determined. The ravine finally came into view, a steep drop bordered by jagged rocks. Below, a small stream gurgled softly, its sound masked by the noise of the chase. Jack knelt beside Arya, gripping her shoulders. Listen to me, he said firmly, meeting her wide silver eyes. We're going to climb down. It's tricky, but they won't follow us easily. Do exactly what I say. Got it? She nodded, clutching the pendant close to her chest. Jack led the way, his hands and feet finding precarious holds on the rocky cliffside. He glanced up frequently to check on Arya, her small frame navigating the descent with surprising agility. They reached the bottom just as the sound of drones buzzed overhead. Jack pulled Arya into the shadows of an overhang, holding his breath as the red lights scanned the area above. The drones lingered for a moment, then moved on. Jack exhaled slowly, tension draining from his body. But relief was short-lived. He knew they wouldn't give up that easily. They followed the stream for miles, the forest growing denser and darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jack's mind churned with questions and plans. The betrayal at the ranger station had been a harsh reminder: they couldn't trust anyone. Whoever was after Arya wasn't just powerful, they were relentless. Finally, they came across a small clearing, the remnants of an old campsite buried beneath moss and fallen branches. Jack decided it was safe enough for the moment. He motioned for Arya to sit while he scouted the area. When he returned, she was huddled by the remnants of a fire pit, her silver eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. Jack knelt beside her, his tone softer now. You okay? She nodded but didn't look up. Her hands trembled as they cradled the pendant, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. You said they can track this, Jack said, pointing to the pendant. How? What does it do? Arya hesitated, then placed the pendant on the ground between them. Signal, calls them, she whispered. But it also hides me. Jack frowned. Hides you? How? Arya tapped the pendant, and a hologram flickered to life, displaying a map dotted with strange, shifting symbols. She pointed to one symbol in particular, a glowing crest that hovered near the edge of the projection. Home, she said, her voice barely audible. They can't find Without this. Jack's mind raced. The pendant wasn't just a tracker, it was a key. A key to Arya's origins, her family, and whatever power her enemies were so desperate to control. It also explained why they wanted her alive. Without her, the pendant was useless. As the hologram faded, Jack leaned back against a fallen log, rubbing his temples. "You're telling me this thing is the only way to find your home?" Arya nodded. "Yes. And, proof." "Proof of what?" Jack asked, though he suspected the answer. "Who I am," she said softly. "My family's crest. Their power." Jack let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Arya wasn't just a child, they had made her into a symbol, a tool of control. The pendant was both her lifeline and her curse. "We can't keep running," Jack said finally. "If they want this so badly, we need to use it against them. We need to fight back." Arya's silver eyes widened. "Fight? How?" "We figure out what this thing does," Jack said, pointing to the pendant. "We use it to expose them, whoever they are. But first, we need someone who can decode it." The fire crackled softly as they rested, exhaustion etched into their faces. Jack's mind wandered to his old contacts, people he had worked with during his time as an aerospace engineer. One name stood out, Dr. Evelyn Chase, a brilliant scientist who had dabbled in experimental technologies. If anyone could make sense of the pendant's secrets, it was her. "We're heading to the city tomorrow," Jack said, breaking the silence. "There's someone there who might be able to help us." Arya looked up, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "City, safe?" "It's safer than this forest," Jack said with a small smile. "And if we're lucky, they won't expect us to go there." Arya nodded, her trust in him unwavering. Jack felt a surge of determination. He had no idea what they were walking into, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let them take her. As the night deepened, Jack stayed awake, his rifle close at hand. Arya slept fitfully beside him, her small frame curled around the glowing pendant. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence heavy with anticipation. Jack stared out into the darkness, his resolve hardening. Whoever these people were, they had underestimated him. They thought they could hunt him, outsmart him. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Tomorrow, the game would change. And this time, it would be on his terms. The City of Secrets. The city loomed on the horizon, its silhouette jagged against the pale dawn sky. Jack's truck rumbled along the deserted road, its engine humming softly in the early morning stillness. Arya sat beside him, the oversized hoodie and sunglasses once again shielding her identity. The pendant hung around her neck, its faint glow hidden beneath layers of fabric. For the first time in days, the forest was behind them, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that danger was just a step away. The betrayal at the ranger station had taught him a bitter lesson, there were eyes everywhere. And if their enemies had infiltrated a small town, the city would be an even more dangerous labyrinth. "We'll stay low," Jack said, breaking the silence. "No wandering off. No talking to anyone unless I say it's safe. Got it?" Arya nodded, her silver eyes peeking out from behind the sunglasses. She seemed calmer now, her trust in Jack solidified after days of survival together. Yet, Jack could see the weight she carried, an entire life uprooted, her family gone, and enemies hunting her relentlessly. She was just a kid, but she bore the burden of something far greater. They entered the city through a quiet industrial district, weaving through empty streets until they reached a nondescript building on the edge of an old warehouse complex. The place was unassuming, its faded signage and overgrown lot hiding the brilliance that lay inside. "This is it," Jack said, parking the truck. He turned to Arya. "Dr. Evelyn Chase is one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. If anyone can help us figure out that pendant, it's her. But we need to be careful, she doesn't know we're coming." Arya nodded, clutching the pendant tightly. Can trust her? Jack hesitated. I hope so. The building's interior was a stark contrast to its exterior, clean, modern, and buzzing with quiet energy. Jack led Arya through a maze of hallways, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. He finally stopped in front of a reinforced steel door with a small keypad beside it. Jack punched in an old code, praying it still worked. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward, revealing a spacious lab filled with monitors, machines, and piles of research papers. At the center of it all stood Dr. Evelyn Chase. She was as Jack remembered, sharp-eyed, with a shock of curly gray hair pulled into a messy bun. She turned as they entered, her gaze landing first on Jack and then on Arya. Her brow furrowed. Jack Harrow, she said, her voice laced with both surprise and irritation. You show up unannounced after 10 years, and you bring, what, exactly? Trouble, Jack admitted, guiding Arya inside. But the kind only you can help with. Evelyn's sharp gaze lingered on Arya, taking in her small frame and the way she clutched the pendant protectively. Who's the kid? Her name's Arya, Jack said. And she's not from around here. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Not from Earth, you mean? Jack nodded. She's being hunted, Evelyn. They're after this. He gestured to the pendant. I need you to figure out what it is, and why it's so important. Evelyn sighed, motioning for them to follow her deeper into the lab. You always bring me the easy problems, don't you? The pendant was placed carefully on a scanning platform, its glow intensifying as Evelyn activated her equipment. Monitors came to life, displaying streams of data and strange symbols. Arya watched anxiously, her silver eyes darting between the screens and the pendant. This tech is incredible, Evelyn muttered, her hands moving deftly across the controls. Way beyond anything we've developed. It's emitting a signal, but it's encrypted, layered with some kind of protective field. It's almost like it's alive. Can you decode it? Jack asked. Evelyn nodded slowly. I can try, but it'll take time. Whatever this is, it's not just a tracker. It's storing data, a lot of it. Maps, schematics, communication logs, it's a treasure trove. Arya shifted uncomfortably. Bad people want it. Evelyn glanced at her, her expression softening. I can see why. This isn't just technology, it's history. Proof of something big. And whoever's after you wants it either to control it or destroy it. Hours passed as Evelyn worked, her mutterings punctuated by the hum of machinery. Jack stayed close to Arya, who had grown increasingly restless. Her gaze kept darting to the windows, as though she could feel the danger drawing closer. Finally, Evelyn straightened, wiping her hands on her lab coat. I've unlocked part of it, she said, her tone grave. This pendant isn't just proof of her lineage, it's a key. A key to an archive hidden somewhere off-world. If what I'm seeing is accurate, it contains everything, her family's history, their knowledge, their power. Jack's chest tightened. And the people hunting her? They want control, Evelyn said bluntly. With this archive, they could rebuild an empire, or destroy it. Before they could process her words, the building's alarms blared, red lights flashing across the lab. Jack's stomach dropped as Evelyn's monitors displayed security footage of armed intruders breaching the entrance. They found us, Jack said, grabbing Arya's hand. We need to move. Evelyn grabbed a device from her desk and shoved it into Jack's hands. This has everything I've decoded so far. Take it. Go. What about you? Jack asked. Evelyn smirked. I'm not the one they're after. Besides, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Jack hesitated, but the sound of gunfire forced his hand. He pulled Arya toward the back exit, his heart pounding as they sprinted through the maze of hallways. Outside, the city was alive with chaos. Drones buzzed overhead, and the glow of searchlights cut through the night. Jack led Arya down an alley, his mind racing. The stakes had just skyrocketed. The pendant wasn't just a key to Arya's survival, it was a weapon in a war they barely understood. As they disappeared into the city's labyrinth, Jack felt the weight of their mission settle on his shoulders. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for something far greater than either of them. And he wasn't about to lose.